Thank you so much for letting me present here. It's an honor. And thank you, everyone who presented before. You guys are incredible. And today, my presentation is about the supernatural, as we said, from a cognitive perspective. So I want to start with the idea that the supernatural throughout history has been very dominant. You can see it in different time periods from different locations around the world. It seems that the human mind have been constantly engaging with the idea of supernatural. And when cognitive scientists noticed this pattern, they started to ask questions as for why and how. And what they found out is that the supernatural creates something that they refer to as a paradox. Because on the one hand, the mere idea of something being supernatural creates a cognitive burden. It's harder for us to understand it, to conceptualize it, or to memorize it, meaning that throughout history, it should not have survived. And yet we see that in the real world, it keeps on happening. So they started to try to better understand what makes something supernatural and how do you explain this paradox. So in order to understand that, we need to take a step back and fully understand what happens in our brains when we encounter something new. So whenever we, be that as a child or as an adult, when we meet someone or something, some kind of entity for the first time, within less than a second, our brain categorizes it into one of 5 ontological groups. And this is a moment that happens without conscious thinking. It's more of a default way that the brain works, as proven in different cognitive experiments. And these 5 categories have a lot of implications. So if we start with the lowest entity, spiritual entity will be something that we only have one expectation from it, and that is to exist in a certain time, in a certain place. It can be a shadow, thoughts, feelings. We have no other expectation for it other than existing. If we move to the second ontological group, we have solid objects. So for them, we don't only expect to exist, but we also have some kind of a physical expectation from. We expect them to be tangible, to not go through another solid object, to not move independently. So things like tables, computer, chairs, you can think of whichever one you want. The next group will be a living thing. So based on the first 2 groups, they should exist, they have physical abilities, but they also have biological expectations. So we expect them to live and die. They will have some kind of biological needs in order to survive, be there food, water, air. You will need something. The next group will be animated. That will be either animals that we give more cognitive abilities to. So, for example, dogs or horses can follow orders. Or it could be now with the new technology, it can be AI tools. And the last group will be person. That these are entities that have their own advanced physical abilities. They can make decisions, they have goals, they have wants, not only needs, and they're going after them. So as you see, each ontological group has their own intuitive theories that are built upon them. So a supernatural will be any entity that, after classifying them to one of these 5 categories, will end up defying these intuitive theories. So if you think of fairy tales, you have, let's say, Little Red Riding Hood and the Bad Wolf. He should be a living thing, but he has the psychological ability of a person. Think and speak. He has goals of his own. He has wants. He basically is an enhanced living thing, thus a supernatural. So once we know what supernatural is, cognitive scientists try to understand how to solve the paradox. Why does our brain, on one hand, create this burden when confronting with supernatural ideas, and yet society shows time after time again that we're actively seeking it. We need it as a society. And so in 1994, Pascal Boyer came up with a solution after checking multiple religious texts. He saw a pattern of minimal counterintuitive, which basically means that within the text that he works on, he saw that stories that survive culturally have shown entities that are supernatural, but they found what he called the cognitive optimum balance, which is, for him, was one. One counterintuitive ability makes the entity, on the one hand, very different, so it's easier for remembering, and yet not different enough so that it becomes a burden. Later researchers that worked on different corpuses within literature found the number to be either 1 or 2. But again, every research that have been published so far have shown that stories that survive, that stories that are still remembered and are still engaged with, other than fantastic stories, which we put them aside because that's a different category, and they work under different rules, all show entities with minimum counterintuitiveness. So again, here's an index. But what happened is, in my research, I work on early modern plays written in England and in Italy. And Shakespeare is obviously one of those playwrights. And it seems that early modern England works differently. And when I say work differently, I mean that if we said that 1 or 2 is the minimum counterintuitive, Shakespeare plays have 4 or even 5 counterintuitive abilities per entity. So today I want to talk about Macbeth, and more specifically about the witches. So we all obviously know the story. I'm not going to get into that. Instead, I want to look at Act 3, Scene 1, because this is the most interesting for a cognitive reading of them. So here we see right at the beginning of the scene, after they enter through lightning and thunder, we see here a small quote that the witches are trading winds, meaning they have the ability to control the weather, which is a violation of intuitive psychology. I give the wind. I don't need to read the rest of the quotes. We all see it here. The next, literally a few lines later, we see them discussing the idea of doing magic, of hurting the sailors because his wife was being rude. And again, it's another violation of intuitive psychology. And you need to understand that the higher the intuitive theory is, the harder it is for our brain to understand it. So if we see a solid object that can disappear, it's easier for us to understand than somebody reading minds or controlling the weather or doing magic, as we see here. Not a lot of lines afterwards, we see them foreseeing the future, which is again another very heavy cognitive burden because it's once again violates our intuitive psychology. So here we see the foreseeing of both Macbeth and Banquo's future, following by them vanishing into air according to the stage directions, which is a violation of intuitive physics, which means that basically within a few minutes, not a lot of lines, a relatively short part of the scene, they are violating 4 different abilities and theoretically should be creating a very, very, very large cognitive burden. However, it seems that the play helps us. So I put here Banker's reaction, because you see, Banker is obviously having his own doubts when he sees the witches, but by framing them and by saying them out loud, he sort of let the audience feel that they're not alone with this hesitation, with this burden that they might be feeling, because they're not the only ones who are unaware or having issues with fully understanding what's going on. And you need to remember that when the play opens and the witches are there and they speak with the forest floor and everything, and they're sort of in the middle of a conversation where we just walk in and they have this different tone, they use different language, so to speak. The audience gets into a position of hesitation, of unawareness, feeling very, very weird, very not sure of what's going on. And when Banker comes and he lets us in to see that we're not the only one who are feeling these doubts or feeling this hesitation. In a way, it helps us as an audience. It sort of lowered the cognitive load from us by saying, you see, you're not the only one struggling. So here I just put again all the four counterintuitive violations, because the next step will be trying to understand what can be possible explanations for it. And the first thing is theater is a visual performance, because up until now, all the cognitive science that have been done regarding MCI theory have dealt with texts that are meant to be read alone and then imagined within the mind. And as fun as that is, when something is maximally counterintuitive, it's harder for us to understand it and it's harder for us to imagine it. However, when you sit as an audience within theater, we don't need to imagine it because we see it in front of us. So that kind of lowers the burden from us. The next possible explanation can be selective activation, meaning, yes, there are four counterintuitive abilities that are attributed to the witches, but in reality, we don't see all four of them. We see them discuss doing magic, but we don't actually see the result of it. We see them discuss controlling the weather, but again, we don't see it in action. And by not seeing it, it helps lower the load from us, because it kind of makes them not less real, but less important to the story, less active, less consuming to our brains. And the last is scene containment, the last possible explanation. Because the witches, as important as they are to the play, as important as they are to the plot, don't really have a lot of screen time. At the end, they have the opening scene, they have the act three, scene one, that's probably their longest time on stage. And then when the apparitions appear, the witches do not have a really important role. They're standing by as apparitions, a different supernatural entity, and gives the prophecies again. Meaning that within the play, their time to be supernatural is relatively low. It's kind of pulses of supernaturalism from their side instead of really long time. However, something that we've seen in other early modern plays that we don't see here, just if it's interesting for comparison, is that usually what other plays did is that per scene they gave us less supernaturalism, meaning they showed glimpses of one or two counterintuitive abilities per scene, so that every appearance would be counterintuitive, while the play as a whole will still be maximum. Here, Shakespeare does something different, as I showed. he showed us a lot of counterintuitive all in once, but for a short time. And this seems to be working. All of that is my long way of saying that there is something in the way that Shakespeare builds the supernatural in Macbeth, and more specifically the witches. There is something, regardless of cultural expectations, regardless of historical context, that I'm not saying it's not important. I think it's extremely important. But I do think that looking at it also from the cognitive perspective might give us a different way of fully understanding the witches. That's it. Thank you so much.